Okay, product management books that are not really product management books, but that I think are really valuable for product managers. Now, I'm going to talk about the four of the books that are on this screen, and then a couple of other ones, as I said. So the first one is the book called Badass, Making Users Awesome. It's by a wonderful thinker about how to make products and a very successful product maker herself, Kathy Sierra. And the reason this is such an important book, and actually going along with it, there's a video that I recommend every product manager look at that she gave at the 2014, I think it was, Business of Software conference, a talk she gave. And that I think is just the best way of thinking about product management, which is essentially that products are not the things that we want to build as product managers or as technologists. They're the things that enable our customers to do the things that they want to do. What makes a product successful is if it enables our customer to do the thing that they want to do, whether that's take better photographs, or manage projects better, or manage their back office better, whatever it might be. Of course, a lot of these are software products that I talk about, but she has a great story about how she created the Head First series of books, which were originally designed to help train people on how to do Java programming. There's a whole range of them. They remain one of the best-selling series of books on Amazon in the technology space. And she basically reverse engineered what it was that her users needed to become great at writing Java programs, which was what their goal was. And it wasn't the types of things that you necessarily think of if you're a technologist and you say, well, how should I teach people to write Java? It was more based on what people actually need. And anyway, there's a great story that she has in that video, and I recommend it. And the book Badass has a lot of really great ideas that she has about how to make your product something that makes the customer awesome. It's not about the product being awesome, it's about the customer being awesome, and that's what that book is about. Anyway, Badass, just one of the best books you can read about product management, and I highly recommend it. And it's the thing I recommend to everybody first, along with the video. That there will be a link to her video in the show notes as well. So a link to the page with the book recommendations and also a link to the video. Okay, that's for Kathy Sierra, Badass, fantastic book. Totally recommend that. The next book that I recommend is called Jumpstart Your Business Brain. It's by a guy named Doug Hall. He is an innovation consultant, and he makes his money by having Fortune 5 people, dozens of people from Fortune 500 companies come out to his farm and spend a week or two coming up with ideas for new products that then become highly profitable and successful. Much of this work that he does is secret, but his techniques are not, or well, some of them are. A lot of them are in this book, though. It's a fantastic book. And again, the reason that I recommend it, first of all, it's not well known in the product management world. I don't even remember how I happened to hear about him, but he's, I guess, relatively well known in the innovation guru world, but not well known in the product management world. And one of the most fundamental things that he talks about in this book, and I've talked about it a lot on my blog and in other cases, is what he calls the 3 laws of marketing physics. And he says that in order to have a successful product, the product has to essentially have 3 things. It has to have what he calls an overt benefit. Now that shouldn't be too surprising. It has to do something valuable for people, and it has to be overt, though. You have to be able to articulate what that benefit is. The second thing it has to have is it has to have a dramatic difference. It has to be different in some way than other products that it might be competing with, so that people just have a reason to choose it rather than the competitors. And it has to have a real reason to believe. In other words, you have to have some way of making your prospects feel that it will actually do the thing that you are promising that it does. And this might be testimonials, whatever it might be. There's obviously things you can think about that go from those obvious 3 marketing principles. But he says that he has really strong data to back up these ideas, and that he says that, for example, if you have a product that only is strong in one of these areas, it has an overt benefit, but not a dramatic difference and not a real reason to believe, then its chances of being successful are much lower than if it has like all 3, or even 2 out of the 3 versus 1. So it's very interesting to read this book. And he talks about all kinds of different examples of how you can use this idea of everything from marketing restaurants to marketing plumbing products to marketing high-tech products and things like that. Anyway, it's a great book. It has a lot of other really good stuff about how to become more innovative as well. But I think that the real value for product managers is this 3 laws of marketing physics and sort of how to drill down on that. But anyway, I highly recommend it. It's a very enjoyable read. He's a fun guy. I've seen him present. He basically, he always wears he only wears Hawaiian shirts. He presents barefoot when he comes up on stage, and he's pretty fun. And I just remembered how I first learned about him. He had a really great show and a podcast that was on NPR, and it was also published as a podcast where he would take questions from people who had small businesses and about how to make their businesses more successful. And he would essentially answer those questions on this podcast. It was fairly fascinating, the kinds of ideas that he had and the ways that he went about thinking about innovation and marketing and creating product success. Anyway, I highly recommend the book, Jumpstart Your Business Brain. The next book that I want to recommend is called Decisive. It's by Chip and Dan Heath, or who I call the Heath brothers. I don't know if they go by that, but I think they do. They've written a number of very useful books for thinking about how to do, essentially helping people change their minds or switch. They have a book called Switch, which is how to help people change their minds. But Decisive is really good, and it's particularly focused on how to make better decisions. Now, better decisions is something that we have to do all the time as product managers. Obviously, as product managers, we make lots and lots of decisions. And the better that we can be at making those decisions, the more likely our products are to be successful. So they have come up with a lot of research-based guidance on how to make better decisions. Some of them, for example, one of the most easy to apply and easiest to use guidances that they have is if you have an either-or decision, essentially where you have 2 options, you can always find other options. You never are really constrained to just 2 options. This is really true in product world. In almost all decision situations, you're not constrained to 2 options. Sometimes it takes a lot of work or innovative intelligence, creativity to find other options. But actually in the product world, at least in my experience, there's almost always other options. Sometimes the option is to not make the decision today, for example. It's to put off the decision or to get more information, whatever it might be. There often may be other options that you can think outside the box. That's really one of the reasons thinking outside the box is so important, is it gets you out of that A or B mindset into thinking about D and E and X and Y and Z. But there are a number of other really great decision-making tools in this book as well. So I highly recommend that book, Decisive. Any book by them is going to be really fun to read. It's going to give you some really good insights. Decisive is probably the most directly applicable to product management. So that's why I recommend it, have it on my book. But any book by them is going to be great. I have another book here showing this fantastic book called Flash Foresight, which is about how to essentially think of the next thing, leap over your current thinking and think about something in the future. It's very inspiring. I have found it, unfortunately, not that easy to apply in a day-to-day basis for product management, even though I highly recommend the book because it's just so interesting and the ways of thinking will probably help get you out of your ruts. But I can't exactly give you a story of how you apply it in day-to-day thinking, but it's a great book. I just highly recommend it. Flash Foresight. It's by a guy named Daniel Burris, who's what is called a futurist. And I remember I first saw Daniel Burris, and I didn't make the connection until much later. I saw him at a talk where he was giving a keynote. It was a presentation, was sponsored by Merrill Lynch or somebody like that. And he was giving the keynote, and he's made this great statement, and it always stuck with me because I made the opposite conclusion, and later on I realized how wrong I was. But he said, if you're not planning for compute power and storage and networking capacity to all be infinite, then you're not planning correctly for the future. And I thought, well, that can't be right because, I'm old enough to remember the Dick Tracy comics, and they'd been going for many, many years when I was even so when I was a kid, but they were still running. And one of the things that Dick Tracy always had was this 2-way wristwatch radio with video. So he could, they didn't call it video in those days, but he could talk to people using this little screen on his wristwatch. Now, this was invented in the 20s. In the comics, obviously, when I first heard Daniel Burris, I said, that is obviously not going to ever be possible. There's never going to be enough bandwidth. Even if Daniel Burris is like directionally true, right, that we should think about bandwidth as being infinite, we're never going to be able to put pictures on our wrists. And of course, what do we have now? Well, we have this thing, which of course I can watch movies walking around with. It's too big for my wrist. Apple, of course, now has an Apple Watch, on which I could watch movies if I wanted. It turns out that the wrist is a bad form factor for watching movies, but it is now possible. So one of the reasons that I really like Daniel Burris is that he broke my brain. I had this very firm belief that something that he said was possible was not possible, and then not that long after that, it turned out to be possible. So it makes me always remember the assumptions that I make, even though I was very sophisticated, and I still am very sophisticated about things like Moore's Law and whatnot, that I was just wrong. And as a product manager, it's very valuable to recognize that you might be wrong. That actually goes to another book that I don't have on my recommended list, but it's called The Invisible Gorilla by Daniel. I'll put a link to it in the show. I'll probably put it on my list of recommended books. It was the first book where I learned about the Dunning-Kruger effect and other types of cognitive biases where we may think we know more than we do, or we make decisions in wrong ways. And of course, there's also Thinking Fast and Slow, another great book that talks about our cognitive biases. But as product managers, we may actually be one of the smartest people in the room, but that also means even though we are that, and often our developers are smarter than we are, don't anybody be fooled, but we're among the smartest people in the room, but that still means that we probably don't know everything and that we're likely to be wrong. And we always have to be checking on ourselves to make sure that the assumptions that we make and the decisions that we make might be wrong. And what do we do if they are? And how do we validate that our intuitions and assumptions are correct? Something I find I have to do all the time as a product manager is just continually have that checkup loop to make sure that what I'm thinking is actually correct. So that is Daniel Burris, and it led into a whole bunch of interesting other topics. But the point is that there's a lot of things that we have to take into account as product managers that are not, they're like about cognitive biases and about how to make better decisions and things like that, and about how to think about not the future thing, but the post-future thing. So the final book on this list is The Lean Startup. You're probably familiar with that, and it is kind of a product management book. But the most important concept in The Lean Startup is not, probably the most important concept is what's called the minimum viable product in the book, but most people misunderstand what the minimum viable product really is, which is essentially a test. The minimum viable product is the minimum amount of work you have to do to validate a hypothesis that you might have about your market or about the people using your product or the usage of your product. And of course, sometimes that may mean something as simple as a web page. Like if you're thinking about creating a new product, sometimes the simplest and easiest way to validate that there's interest in your product is to create a simple web page, drive some traffic to it, and see if people sign up. And there's no reason to build anything more than that until you've validated that there's that demand. And that is actually one of the examples in the Lean Startup of a minimum viable product. And unfortunately, a lot of product managers, I think, have misinterpreted this concept of minimum viable product. And they've said, well, it has to be a product, it has to be something people can buy. And the fact is it's not. Or you can say that another way, which is that I want to validate that people will give me attention. That's a way of buying something. And you don't have to do much work to validate that people will give you attention. You may have to now there's other kinds of hypotheses you have where you do have to build stuff, where you can't just find out from a web page. But the point is, it's the simplest thing you could do to get the answer that you are to the question that you're asking. And that's what a minimum viable product is. And he talks about that in the Lean Startup. There's a lot of other interesting concepts like the pivot But I think the most valuable thing from the standpoint of product management on a day-to-day basis is what is the minimum amount I can do to validate that this is a good idea before I invest a lot in it. And it actually goes to a lot of other things that I've talked about over the years in the podcast and on videos and various things like investment options. The idea of investment option is that you invest a little, you give somebody the option to invest a little now and for a big return later, and what you're going to use that initial investment for is validating that they're validating or improving the odds of that eventual payoff happening. But you need some investment initially to do that initial testing, and that initial testing is often something that's very similar to an MVP. It's a small test. It's a way of reducing some risk. It's a way of answering a hypothesis. And so investment options and lean startup tie together really well. Now, in fact, the guy that I originally heard about investment options from, whose name is escaping me, David Bianetti, I'm pretty sure is the guy. I'll put a link to his stuff in the show notes as well. He originally came up with this innovation options and started to talk about it a lot in the context of lean startup. He worked with Eric Ries about that. So anyway, the Lean Startup by Eric Ries, you're already familiar with it. I went on a little rant. Okay, fine. Let's move on. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, I mentioned Badass as the first book that I always recommend. I also recommend a video. And so the idea from about Badass, the fundamental concept here from Kathy Sierra is your tool is an X, but you don't want to build a better user of X. You want to create a customer who can build Z's better. That's what they're interested in. And your tool X is going to help them with that. Anyway, I tried to summarize it. There's a lot more to the book than this, but I just wanted to see if I could summarize that a little bit. Anyway, I have 3 other books that I also want to recommend, and there's a lot of books that I could recommend, and I've already added a couple more. But 3 of them that I think are really valuable. And one of these, it's very likely you've heard of. 2 you may have heard of. The first is Drive, and this is a book about the science of motivation, what motivates people. And I think Drive is most interesting this is by a guy named Dan Pink, who's written, again, a lot of really useful science-based books about how people behave, how to make better decisions, he has a really good book on how to sell better. But Drive is about motivation. And I think motivation is really interesting from the standpoint of a product manager, because one of the things that we have to do as product managers is convince people to do things. In other words, to motivate them. And another word you could use there is influence, to influence people. And Drive is a great book for understanding a lot of stuff about influence and motivation. And one of the sort of key takeaways that I have from the book Drive is that motivation consists of 3 really important things for people that do knowledge type work, like we do, like our development team does, like our sales team do. All of the folks around us in high tech particularly are knowledge type workers. And so there's 3 big important components for them of motivation. You can think of them with the acronym MAP: mastery, autonomy, and purpose. So mastery is, are they good at what they do, and are they continually getting better? And are they able to apply the things that they know and are experts in to solving the problem or to achieving the goal? So that's one component of motivation. It's much more motivating for people who have expertise to be able to make use of their expertise. Autonomy is, are they able to use their knowledge to come up with solutions as opposed to being given a solution or an approach that they have to follow? And so you can think about this as one of the things we like to do as product managers, or one of the things we should do, is not give our development team a solution to build. We should give them a problem to solve. This is often much more motivating for them, because then they get to use their autonomy and their mastery to create a good solution. And it's probably a better solution than we might be able to give them anyway. That's one of the goals of building a team, is that they're better at solving problems than you are. You're good at finding problems. That's what should be your primary job as a product manager, and articulating those problems. And then it also ties into the third component of motivation, which is purpose. Why should I solve this problem? And one of your goals as a product manager is to be able to articulate why this problem is worth solving. And it's going to have multiple different components. It's going to be a problem that's really important to some people in the market, which means that they will be willing to pay for it, which means that your company will be able to make a profit if the company builds a solution, or if your team builds a solution that the company can then sell. So that's how purpose fits in to the whole product management world. Now, I think what's very interesting about mastery, autonomy, and purpose is it also ties in really well with what I call the secret product manager framework, which is that what we do as product managers is we find market problems, we drive the creation of solutions, and a lot of that is about motivating people to build good solutions. So that ties into this motivation thing. And then we take those solutions to market. And that's about motivating and influencing prospects to decide to buy our solution versus the competitors. So it all ties together. I think it's kind of fun in that way. The next book that I want to talk about and highly recommend is called The Inmates Are Running the Asylum by Alan Cooper. And it sounds like this could be any number of books based on that title. But what it really is about how essentially high-tech products, many of them, are not good. And the reason that many of them are not good, if you boil it down, is because they are built by technologists using their own ideas about what makes good. And this is actually it's another way of approaching the idea that Kathy Sierra writes about in Badass, which is to essentially really say the way to make great products is to put yourself in your user's shoes or your customer's shoes, figure out what they want to do, and figure out what their problem is, and then build a solution to that problem, as opposed to the solution that the technologist thinks is to the problem that the technologist thinks there is. And so the Inmates Are Running the Asylum, very interesting approach. It's a little different from the lean startup approach. It's a little different from the Badass approach. And he uses a term called, well, it'll come to me. It should be on the tip of my tongue. But he has an approach to discovering users' problems and then designing solutions to those problems that then get built and become successful products. He has a very good track record in doing this, Alan Cooper. And the book is it's a fun book to read. It's a great screed for part of it about how terrible technology products are as a rule. And it also gives a lot of good guidance on how to solve that problem. And one of my favorite concepts from that book, and I've talked about it in various articles as well, is what he calls personal goals. So part of what he says is that a lot of the problem with the products that we often build is that they don't address the user's personal goals. Oftentimes they do address the business goals that the user or the customer might have, but they don't address other goals like the personal goals. And a good example, the example I always use is if I am a user of some software or a doer of some business process, right? Whether or not I'm using software to do that, I may be able to complete the process. I may be able to achieve the business goal of the process, but it may be at the cost of, for example, being extremely bored. It might be a really tedious process, or it might be at the cost of maybe making errors and then looking like an idiot when my errors show up. And so if you think about the types of, the personal goals there would be the inverse of those. I'm not bored when I do this process. I can do it quickly. I can do it with no errors. And those are often things that we don't think about explicitly when we're building products. And another one I always like to use is, by using your product, this is the example of a personal goal being achieved. By using your product, I'm able to leave on time to get to my kid's baseball game. That's a personal goal achieved. If the alternative is a product that either makes me spend late hours at work or where I don't even have a solution to that, that is an example of personal goals not being achieved. And there's a lot of other examples. I have a bunch of them. I'll put some links into some of my personal goal examples or articles into the show notes. So then finally, a book you've probably heard about called Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore. He, again, has written many books about essentially product development, product marketing, they're really product management books. In fact, Crossing the Chasm in some ways was like the seminal product management book. There was another one that came before it that was based on I think that was by, don't remember the author, but it was called Managing High-Tech Products, that preceded this, and actually a lot of the thinking in that drove what Jeffrey Moore was thinking about in Crossing the Chasm. But I think there's a couple of really important ideas in Crossing the Chasm that we often forget about. We think about that chasm. Sorry, I hit the microphone. We think about that chasm where, the product adoption life cycle and the chasm that it has between early adopters and the mainstream market, and that's very important. It is still very important to think about that. But some other really important concepts that don't get as much attention are things like what he called the bowling alley strategy. And the really important thing about the bowling alley strategy is that what you want to do is you want to look for a segment of the market that has the problem that you solve so intensely that they're willing to spend anything to get a solution. So if you can create a solution for those people, they will buy it right away. They'll spend a lot of money on it. They'll give you a huge amount of valuable feedback. And instead of trying to sell your solution to everybody who might have the problem at any different level, the bowling alley strategy is find the people that have the problem most critically, address them, focus all your marketing and sales on them, and then when you've saturated that market and gotten all their money, you look for another market that's adjacent and they have the problem a little not quite as bad, or they're a little harder to reach or something like that, but they're adjacent. And the idea is the mental picture is you're going after a set of bowling pins. The head pin is the segment of the market that has the problem the worst. The next pins are adjacent to those, and maybe you can get into those markets if you've already captured the head pin market. It's a really great concept, and it helps us remember that to be most successful selling, we have to sell to the people that have the problem, and to be even more successful in that, we have to sell to the people that have the problem the worst. It's a great way to accelerate our sales. So that's one of the great concepts. The other really good concept I love from Crossing the Chasm is the idea of the whole product. And that's the idea of, it's not just the product you're selling, the sort of technology that you're selling that's the customer buys, but it's a lot of other stuff. It's the service, it's the support, it's the knowledge that you embed, or the field services that you provide, or things like that. And it's really good to think about the whole product, not just the technology, as the solution that the customer is buying. It helps you think about some things that I often talk about, like how you put knowledge into your product or into your offering. And it's one of the things that makes the difference often in a competitive situation, is how much knowledge are you putting in? How much richer is your whole product versus your competitor's whole product? And it's something to think about if you're trying to be successful with products. So anyway, those are 3 more books. So I think I've given you 5 plus 3, 8 books, and I've mentioned 2 others in this. I think these are all great books that you will find extremely valuable. If you take a look at the show notes, you'll find links to all of these books and to various articles that I've written that are related to some of these concepts, like the 3 laws of marketing physics and the idea of personal goals. If you are interested in learning more about what I do, you can take a look at my blog. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Nilsey. I have a book that talks about a lot of these topics as well. So personal goals, for example, it's a whole chapter in my book. I appreciate your watching. Until next time, this is Nils Davis signing off. Hope you enjoyed it.